So before we get to that, let me start talking about options. Now, I think most of you know what an option is. It's a financial security that gives you the right, but not the obligation to engage in a financial transaction. A call option gives you the right to buy a stock on or before a certain exercise date. A put option gives you the right to sell a stock on or before a certain exercise date. And the history of options is particularly important here at Sloan for several reasons. So you probably know that Black and Scholes published this very famous paper on option pricing along with Bob Merton, his rational theory of option pricing, in May of 1973. Now, normally academic publications aren't a cause for celebration or even note, but the reason that it was in this case is because of a very happy coincidence. And the happy coincidence is that in the very same year, 1973, in April, the Chicago Board Options Exchange began trading. So in the very same year that this new exchange in Chicago sprang up to trade exchange-traded options, these are standardized options contracts that anybody could trade. In that same year, these academics came up with a mathematical formula for pricing them. And it was an extraordinarily happy coincidence because that actually got this idea of statistical and mathematical formulas to price various financial securities. It got that to be the industry standard. By 1975, the Chicago Board Options Exchange adopted the Black-Scholes-Merton formula as the official option pricing formula. Now, it doesn't mean that that's the only way to price an option. In fact, very often you'll see option prices deviating from Black and Scholes. But the framework that they introduced was incredibly powerful. And not surprisingly, it was taken up because right around the same time, Texas Instruments introduced this SR52 calculator. Most of you, I think, are too young to remember this, but I actually had one of these things. And it was an incredible device because you could do all sorts of trigonometric and algebraic functions at the touch of a button, which in 1973 and 75 was pretty cool. But there's another interesting aspect of this story that I just learned a few years ago, which is that at the Chicago Board Options Exchange, the way that these Texas Instruments calculators became standard for floor traders was because of a particular individual named Erwin Guttag. He was one of the founders of the Chicago Board Options Exchange and sat on their executive committee. And Erwin had a son who at the time was a high school student, pretty good at math, and at the time there weren't many computers around, but he was certainly adept at the various kinds of computing instruments that did exist. In those days, I guess it was probably the slide rule. Most of you have no idea what that is. Never mind, it doesn't matter. But these calculators that came out that were relatively new, his son, John, ended up taking up the instruction manual, reading it, absorbing it, and learning how to program it. And his son programmed the Black-Scholes formula for Erwin. And then Erwin took it to the floor traders, and pretty soon all the floor traders had this calculator. So that was part of the reason that the Black-Scholes formula became popular. The reason this is interesting is because Erwin's son, John, you may have heard of John Guttag. He used to be the chairman of the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science department here, and he's still on the faculty. So that's a kind of an interesting connection of computing and finance. Now that connection it doesn't come cheap. At the time, a calculator was $400, which is about $1,800 in today's dollars. But from the perspective of these traders, that was nothing compared to what this will allow you to do in terms of very quickly figuring out what this piece of paper, this call option or put option was worth. And since then, the size of options markets have grown exponentially. So this is the annual US options trading volume for all the various different exchanges that trade options. And you can see that, like this hockey stick picture that we see in most financial securities, it grew exponentially after the 1970s when this was first introduced. Now, a particularly interesting development occurred right here in 2000 when the International Securities Exchange was created. This is an exchange that is an all-electronic exchange for people to trade options. It was created by none other than Bill Porter And the reason that we are sitting in this building today is because of the success of his venture. So if you take a look at non-exchange traded options, OTC options, these are derivative securities that are traded bilaterally. There's not an organized exchange. Two parties come together and agree on terms. That's even larger. So the size of the OTC derivatives markets is on the order of the world GDP. It's measured in the tens of trillions of dollars. It's really extraordinary. And it's because these securities allow people to move risk around back and forth to people who are best able to take it, and allow people to get rid of it who really aren't in a position to bear that kind of risk. And in 1997, of course, Bob Merton and Myron Scholes received the Nobel Prize for their option pricing work. Fisher Black would have gotten it as well, but he had died a few years before of cancer, and so was not able to receive it.